Okay, today we're going to talk about the first of the humanistic theories that we'll be covering, and I figured we'd start with the most well-known, and that is, well, there are several names up there. We're going to talk about Rogerian Therapy, which started off with the title non-directive, and we'll talk about how that came to be. He then changed it to client-centered, and its current incarnation is called person-centered therapy. Now, if you remember in one of the Freud lectures, I talked a little about the kind of three different sort of schools of psychotherapy, the humanistic being sort of the second school of psychotherapy. So if we think about the psychoanalytic school of therapy or psychodynamic being people who were focused on human development, really spent a lot of time looking at unconscious forces, time looking at drives, and looking at either the id, Freud was more idnal, or the ego, self-psychologist, ego-psychologist being more looking at the ego. But the idea of gaining insight, the idea of gaining awareness, working through transference and things like that, as being important in those models. Moving into the humanistic model, we're now talking about a bunch of people who were very much into being growth-oriented. So they were invested in the idea of personal development and people becoming the best person that they could possibly be. So if you remember sort of the Maslow's scale of the hierarchy of needs, and the top need being self-actualization. Self-actualization is this, I'm going to be the best person possible. And when, there have been studies done on people around the globe who have truly self-actualized, people like Gandhi come to mind, but generally speaking, it's seen that most of us never truly self-actualize as well as we possibly could. But the idea that we all move towards that, we move towards being the best person for ourselves, for perhaps our family, and for the world. That's where these humanistic or growth-oriented models were. They were very popular in the 60s and 70s. And again, if you look contextually at different theoretical models in a context of their time and place, if you look at sort of what the United States, because these theorists all lived here, even if they weren't necessarily born here, for example, Pearls emigrated here. But if you think about what was the social climate like in the US in the 60s and 70s, they were seen as being the me generations, where I'm going to focus on who I am. And it wasn't necessarily seen as a time of personal sacrifice. It wasn't seen as a time of family orientation. It was seen as a time of, I'm going to develop me to be the best person that I can be. And one of the reasons that some of these theories may have fallen a little bit out of favor is that people looked back in the 80s and 90s and said, is this really the best thing for society? Is this the best thing for children? For parents to be focused on their own personal development, but does that come at the cost of a culture and at the cost of raising a good family and of parents staying married to each other and sacrificing their own personal development for the development of their family and so forth? So there's some kind of moral, ethical, philosophical debates that we may discuss on Blackboard. I'm referring to this, but Carl Rogers is certainly of the humanistic therapists, is probably the first name that people will think of in this movement, and his main tenets of his model are very much alive and well and have been incorporated into other therapies. So we're going to talk about, as I have up here on the board, 6 necessary and sufficient conditions for change. Whether or not you think they're necessary and sufficient, many people see them as important, and so in other models, in the cognitive behavioral models, in solution-focused models, and reality therapy models, they draw on Rogers's main tenet that therapy is really a way of being rather than a way of doing. And so while you're solution-focused, your reality, your cognitive, your behavioral, your gestalt, a lot of your other therapists have a lot of doing things. Many of them really adopt, to a smaller or greater extent, Rogers's ideas of the way of being, and then they add a lot of doing things. But Rogers really focused a lot, as you'll see, on this just way of being. So where does this come from? Well, Rogers believes, and in order to do Rogerian therapy, if any of you were, as you're looking about what seems to fit me best, in order to be a good Rogerian therapist, you have to have a basic philosophical outlook on life, which says humans are good and humans are growth-oriented by the fact of being born. So because I exist, because I was created, I am good and growth-oriented. If you believe both of those tenets, and then you believe, Rogers went on to believe that, and if babies were just allowed to develop naturally, all of us would develop along a healthy pathway towards self-actualization. What happens, what leads to emotional trauma, what leads to psychopathology, what leads to perhaps criminal behavior, what leads to societal problems, is not that we are born evil, or we are born bad, or we are born troubled, or we are born genetically flawed with, depression genes and psychosis genes and ADHD genes and autism and stuff like that. The problem is that things get in the way of our ability to develop along our sort of natural made or God-given path towards growth and goodness. So, given that we could just grow and develop on our own, we would do so well. It's these things that impede the process that lead us to kind of develop in quirky, unhealthy ways. Then the goal of therapy is to help people remove all of this stuff that society has placed upon them, which led to them growing kind of crooked and twisted, and help them to regrow in a healthful fashion again. Now, if you don't, in your core of core, believe that people are good and are growth-oriented and have all they need when they're born, or at least gain it along the way. If you believe you need to give something to clients, if you believe you need to direct clients, then you're going to take perhaps some of Rogers's ways of being, but you're going to want to do some doing in addition. I'm going to check and see if they have a class. Okay. So if you believe that people need something in addition to simply kind of freeing the things that get in their way of growth and development, but that they need a sense of direction, that they need tools, that they need to learn things, then you may choose to adopt some of Rogers's ways of being, but you may want to add to that some ways of doing from some of the other therapy models, because this model really is, you offer the client a free life space with some conditions, as I have on the board over there, that we'll get to in a few minutes, and the client will naturally grow and develop. So it really puts an enormous amount of faith in the client that you, the therapist, really don't have to keep offering suggestions and solutions and have them taking classes and all this. You're just there for them, you provide them a place to be who they are, and that opportunity allows them to develop and be who they are meant to be. And Rogers believes that this will work with people who have problems with depression, who have personality concerns, who have problems with psychosis. He really believes it's kind of a model which will influence and affect all individuals. So if we have that all of us would have developed, now Rogers may certainly, if he were alive today, may certainly say that issues like autism, issues like schizophrenia, he may look at biological research and say, yeah, okay, there are certainly clearly some genetic reasons why some people may grow in a different path. But given a sort of somewhat healthy biological start, his theory would probably still hold pretty true. What is it that does get in our way? What thwarts us? What, if we're supposed to grow straight and tall towards the sun, what causes us to kind of twist around and twirl around and end up gnarled instead of the way that we should? Well, Roger says what happens is when we're born, we have this direct organismic valuing thing. This is my sense of, I know who I am. I know I'm hungry. I know I'm cold. I know I want to snuggle with somebody. I know that I'm sleepy. I know that I'm wide awake. I know that this food tastes good to me. But as we get older, we start realizing that our parents think different things. And so if I am very hungry, but my mom pulls the bottle away and says to me, sorry dear, but you've had enough, you're full. I may not feel full, but mom has told me I'm full. How many times can you remember your parents saying something to you such to the effect of, you don't need to go to the bathroom, you just went an hour ago, or you're not hungry, you just finished dinner, or honey, you need to go to bed, you must be tired, and you feel completely wide awake. Roger says that our sense of self, I'm wide awake, but then dad says, you're tired, you need to go to sleep. Or, my bladder feels full, I need to use the restroom, but mom told me, no, you just went 10 minutes ago, you can't need to use the restroom again. What happens? And so our sense of this is the way the world is comes into conflict with what other important people in our lives are telling us, and this causes some distress. The other thing he says is that as we grow, people put on us these things called conditions of worth. Conditions of worth are if I believe that, life can go along and I'm a wonderful person and so forth, and then someone says, well, Heather, if you do your math homework, thus and such, but if you don't do your math homework, we're not going to be able to do that. Well, that's one thing, but then if I read or I hear my parents saying, if I come home with a good report card and my parents give me a big hug and they say, oh, this is wonderful, honey, we love you so much, you're so smart and you're making us so proud. And then I come home with a really bad report card and they say, you need to study harder, I am so disappointed in you, dear. Go to your room and study for the next month and don't even think of coming out until you bring up those grades. That's a condition of worth. I, as a child, developed this belief that I'm lovable if I get good grades. But if I get bad grades, I'm going to be cut off from my sources of love and nurturance, which are my family. So I start thinking, in order to be loved, I need to be like this. Well, that may be what my parents say. Then my teachers say something, and then my pastor says something, and then my best friend says something, and then I hit adolescence, and all my friends say completely different things, probably from what my teacher and pastors are saying, and by now I am so confused. Roger says that these are the factors which lead to growing up kind of twisted and gnarled, which get called emotional problems or psychological problems or mental health troubles in adulthood. Then we come into therapy. What a Rogerian approach does, it is non-directive. Non-directive means that the therapist does not tell you where you're going or what you're doing. The therapist is there to follow, not to lead. So if a client comes in, a Rogerian therapist is going to be very relaxed and just say, tell me what brings you here. And then is going to follow the client, isn't going to have a kind of preordained notion of this is what the client needs to do and this is how a therapy session goes and these are issues which are important to work on. Just kind of tell me how I can be helpful to you. Or sometimes what Rogers used to say is, I'd like to get to know you better. And then where the client takes it, the therapist will follow. It's very non-directive. I have found that when students are practicing doing Rogerian therapy in class, it is painfully hard to be non-directive. We all want to offer suggestions and solutions and guide them here and ask them about that and do this. And anytime you ask the client a question, you are directing them. To follow them, you can ask for clarification of what they're talking about, but when you bring up a new topic, you have led that client. They are no longer in charge. You are in charge. That is a directive, not a non-directive therapy. So this, although seemingly easy to be non-directive because you just follow, is in actuality really, I find, very hard for people to do. So what Roger says you do need to have for a good therapy is these necessary and sufficient conditions. Necessary means you gotta have it. Without it, you don't have what you need. If you look at the notes which are posted on Blackboard, I have a big piece on necessary and sufficient conditions, and I go into how to make chocolate chip cookies as an analogy for necessary and sufficient. So necessary is you gotta have it. And sufficient is, and once you have all those components, that's all you need. You don't need anything else. So gotta have it, and once you got it, that's enough. So you could have 5 of these, that would be necessary, but not sufficient. You could, if you only had 3, it would be not sufficient. So what are these? Well, the first thing you need is psychological contact. Sometimes this is called presence. Psychological contact is a meeting of the psyche between the therapist and the client. There's a connection between the both of them. And pretty much all models of therapy will buy into this notion that you need a psychological contact with your client. Now this condition, the 3 non-star conditions, are things which are either client, sort of in charge of the client, or they're client and therapist controlled. So for psychological contact, the therapist needs to have presence, but the client needs to come along for the 2 of them to meet. Once you have psychological contact, you also need, the client needs to bring with him or her this sense of incongruence. Incongruence means some sense of discomfort, unhappiness, incompleteness. Something isn't right in my life. Whether they come in and say, I have clinical depression and have been on Zoloft for the last 3 years and it's not working. Whether they come in and say, my marriage is on the rocks. Whether they come in and say, I just don't feel right. But there needs to be some incongruence, some level of discomfort, because that sort of provides the motivation for therapy to work. Now, Roger says sometimes clients come in and they don't necessarily have this at the outset, but they may develop it, and that may be clients who somebody else thinks should be there. You know, the person with the drinking problem who their spouse, partner, or the state believes would really benefit from therapy. The kid who the teacher or the parent says, this kid is driving me nuts, fix him. May come in, I don't see what their problem is, but sometimes through kind of being gentle, through working with them, through allowing them to take charge, they will start to see, well, you know, I guess not doing any homework and smoking dope every night after school really probably isn't going to result in a very good future for me. So little by little, incongruence may develop even among clients who don't necessarily come walking with it in the door. So self-referred clients probably come with this, whereas other referred clients may take a couple sessions, but assumedly it will develop, or at least many times it will, and you gotta have it. Congruence and genuineness, this is on the part of the therapist. Congruence or genuineness in the therapist is that you, in terms of your thoughts, in terms of your feelings, and in terms of your behavior, are at one with yourself. So that if you are feeling relaxed and happy, you're having relaxed and happy thoughts, you have a relaxed and happy demeanor, and so your posture, your mood, and your thinking are all sort of relaxed and happy. If you're with the client and you're really, sort of liking them, then that's congruent. It's easy to be genuine and congruent when you're connected with the client, when you like the client, when there's a genuine sense of we're working together. It's harder when you have a client who drives you nuts, or a client who puts you to sleep. So one of the stories I tell in a lot of classes is about a client I worked with a number of years ago. Very nice person, medical student, dedicated, hardworking, but she was like a sleeping pill to me. She would come in from 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock, and I would start yawning around 5:45 and could barely stay awake until 7 when she left. Another client who was very engaging came in and I was suddenly wide awake. Now, if I were to be congruent, which I wasn't, if I were to be congruent, I would somehow share with her through my body language and through my words that there was something about our sessions together which led me to feel tired or sleepy or uninspired, and could we please explore what this was? But I just thought, if I tell her that, she's just going to be crushed. And you tell a client she's boring and she puts you to sleep, and you wouldn't put it in those words, but that may be what she'd hear no matter how delicately you put it. So I just pinched myself, tried to make my eyeballs stay open and look interested. I wasn't being congruent. If you're really angry with a client, to be congruent is to share that in some way, shape, or form with a client. Now this is, you're probably gaining a sense of, can be really very challenging. Because if you're angry with a client, or you really don't like a client, or you dread them coming in, it's hard to tell tell them that in such a way that they just don't put up a defensive wall and storm out and say, I'm never going to therapy again. So to do this well really takes some skill, but I can certainly appreciate that if you can do it well, if a client is causing you to be very angry, it's likely that he or she brings that reaction out in others and could really benefit from learning about it. If a client is putting me to sleep, it may be that she puts other people to sleep and she has trouble in interpersonal relationships because people may not want to be around her because something about her is, like a great NyQuil or Excedrin PM pill or something like that. She's just a great sleeping pill. Well, she could learn, if we could explore together and she could learn what that is, she may have better social relationships. So this is important but not always easy to do. Unconditional positive regard is this notion that you genuinely have positive regard for your client. You have warm feelings of affection for them, unconditionally. So if your client comes in and tells you about some dirty, rotten, awful thing they did, you may not necessarily love the thing they did, but you still have a real sense of connection with this client. And again, this can be easier or harder depending on who your client is. So certainly students who work up at the penitentiary have clients who, for many of us, it would be hard to like. And yet, to do good work at the penitentiary, you probably need to learn how to have unconditional positive regard for people who really aren't necessarily particularly likable to most members of society. So whether it's an ability to see the person outside of sort of the demeanor and the actions, but you have to have some way to connect and to genuinely continue to value that individual despite what their actions are. Because as Roger says, this is what people need to grow. They need to know that you will love them unconditionally. A child, ideally parents will love them unconditionally, whether they have good grades, bad grades, do drugs, stay on the straight and narrow, follow your religion and values or don't. Ideally, you love your kid. Ideally, you feel favorably about your clients. Like this one, probably easier said than done, but ideally that's the condition you try to create. I'm going to put these up. This is in the wrong place. The last condition that over which you, the therapist, have the control is empathy. You want to empathize with your client. This is being able to understand what the client's feelings are, where the client is at this point in time. So if the client is feeling sad, you can understand and be aware of and appreciate their sadness. If the client is feeling angry, you have an empathy and understanding for where their anger is coming from. And personally, I find this one probably easier than either of these two. These are the three conditions when people think about Rogers. These are the therapist-produced, created conditions of this way of being. The genuineness, the empathy, and the unconditional positive regard are in textbooks across America of sort of the three Rogerian conditions that the therapist creates for therapy. And Roger says if you create those conditions and the client brings these conditions, you've got an effective treatment. The last one is that the client comes in with and there's a psychological contact made. The client is incongruent in some way. You, the therapist, provide these three conditions, and the client perceives that to be there. So if you're very empathic, but the client doesn't think so, you're very congruent, but the client doesn't recognize it, and you have unconditional positive regard, but the client thinks you have all these conditions of worth upon them, that my therapist will only like me if I do this and say this and wear these clothes and sit like this and make this kind of eye contact and don't do that, then even though you have them all, the client doesn't perceive it and it's not going to work. Once you have all of these, you have a therapy. And Roger says you have all you need for treatment to work. The client then is freed up. They are able to remove these conditions of worth that led them to grow in this twisted neural fashion and to grow back straight, beautifully towards the sun and to develop into, whatever they were meant to develop into. It looks very simple. In reality, personally, I myself have a hard time not wanting to add to do some of the doingness, to offer suggestions or solutions or reading or take this class or do that, because it seems like clients come in and there's just, if I could just offer them this way of looking at things or this, but Roger says, bite your tongue. So how do you do that? This is where, what do you do in therapy? You're congruent, you have unconditional positive regard, you're empathic, you're being non-directive. What are you doing? And that's where you're following the client. So the client comes in with whatever he or she is choosing to talk about, and you follow them. And you do that through, people will sort of do the joking with Rogers where you mirror what the client says. That's kind of like restating what the client has said in different words. You reflect or you mirror. Or you ask for clarification. So the client says, well, I had a real argument with my boss today. And you may ask them to extend that, tell me a little bit more, or an argument with your boss. But those would be ways of sort of either an argument with your boss might be sort of a mirroring or reflection, or tell me more would be say a little bit more about that, which is mildly directive, but not terribly directive. I have a hard time doing the mirroring, reflecting thing, but when my son was growing up, I realized that conversation with a 2-year-old was very much exactly like a perfect Rogerian dialogue, where Jeremy would come home from, let's say, preschool. Let's say he's the age of 3 and he comes home from preschool. Hi, Mom, I had fun in preschool today. And I'd say, you had fun in preschool? And he said, oh yeah, that was great. Well, Kevin came over and we started playing this game together. And I said, you started playing this game together? Oh yeah, we had a ball and we started throwing the ball up the slide. You started throwing the ball up the slide. Oh yeah, and then we'll go up the slide and we'll come down the slide really fast and then we go and we chase it. So it would go up and down the slide and you'd go and chase it. Yeah! Oh, and then the teachers came out. And the teachers didn't like the game very much. Oh, the teachers didn't like the game very much. No! It's a very normal conversation for an adult to have with a 2-year-old child. It's harder to have that same type of conversation when you have a 40-year-old sitting across the chair from you in a therapy session. But for myself personally, it was helpful to have those conversations with a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old kid. And then say, if I can do it with a kid, I could sort of extend it. And that's a way to follow where the client goes instead of take the client where you want to go. And you gotta remember to bite your tongue. So when you wanna say, have you read this book? Have you signed up for this class? Have you done this? Maybe you could try that. You just wanna say, I'm not directing. It's easier said than done. Anyway, that's Carl Rogers.